Hola, buenos dias, bon dia, good morning. Lovely to welcome everyone to Barcelona. As you can tell already by my poor Catalan and Spanish, I'm from the UK originally, but have the pleasure to call this home. Today we've got a great panel lined up to talk about diagnostics for oncology and more. I think just to start it off, you hear a lot. I like the 4 Ps model in healthcare: the predictive, preventative, personalized, and participating. And for me, the crux of all of that is to have strong diagnosis in place to be able to personalize the treatments for all of us. And that's why I think diagnostics is really close to my heart, and I know the hearts of the people on this panel today. Quickly, introductions. I'm Anthony Vallance-Owen. I work at We Venture Capital. We've got a booth outside. Please come and see us if you don't know us already, but we invest globally in diagnostics. Andreas, maybe go down the panel and just introduce yourselves and a little bit about what you do and where you're from.
Andreas, Halner, based in the UK, Oxford. I'm the president and COO of Oxford Cancer Analytics, and we're focused on revolutionizing cancer detection, focusing on early detection through transformative technologies in a non-invasive way that we can scale across the world.
Yep. Hi, I'm Thériault, managing partner of Cross-Border Impact Ventures. We invest in women's and children's health technologies in North America and Europe, and we focus only on technologies that are globally relevant, including in emerging markets.
Hi, I'm Marina, Rigau, CEO and co-founder of MiMARK Diagnostics. We are a startup here in Barcelona working in the health of women, and more specifically in gynecological diagnostics. So looking for minimizing the invasiveness of the diagnostics in this field.
Great, thank you everyone. And maybe let's start with you. And when we talk about diagnostics, we've got 2 great companies here on the stage. And you talk about minimizing how invasive it is. So maybe just a little bit more about your technology and why there's a problem there in terms of invasiveness in making diagnostics more accessible.
So for gynecological diagnostics and gynecological cancers, we have, for instance, the holy grail with ovarian cancer. We cannot access the tissues, so we cannot diagnose cancer at early stages, and this is critical for providing treatment options to patients. So early diagnoses with low invasive methods are very much required and needed when there are diseases that are not showing symptomatology, so that we need to access to these diagnostic methodologies that are low invasive.
Very good. And what's the approach you guys have taken to really get around that? And where are you in that journey?
What we are doing is using gynecological fluids, the uterine fluid or the cervical fluid, as a source of reliable biomarkers. We have seen that these fluids resembles very much what's going on the gynecological organs, and this is the approach that we are following.
Amazing. And Andreas, I mean, you guys looking at something very similar in the sort of early screening and making that more accessible. So maybe just a little bit more on what you're up to at Oxcam.
Thanks. This is a fascinating area. Fundamentally, with cancers, we have a problem in healthcare, which is that almost all cancers are detected at late stage, particularly the deadliest cancers. So our initial focus is on lung cancer because you have over 3/4 of all lung cancer cases diagnosed at late stage at the moment. And that means that for most of those patients, the cancer is terminal, according to the current paradigm. So what we want to do is try and shift that so that the majority of cancer cases can be detected at the earliest stage, and hopefully then curative treatment is possible. And the issue is that at the moment, when we're looking at cancer screening, I mean, lung cancer doesn't even have a reliable screening test. The best we currently have is waiting for symptoms to emerge. There have been some studies looking at CT scans of patients, but again, there are limits in terms of being able to detect the cancer at a very early stage. There are also cost and access issues for patients across the world, depending on where you're in as well. So you need to have some way of doing it routinely in a non-invasive way, and also at a cost which is affordable for healthcare systems. So we're looking at a blood-based method where we can collect samples of blood from patients who are known to be at risk, and then use a biomarker discovery approach focused on protein and machine learning to then select the ideal combination of protein biomarkers from the blood, which can then identify patients most at risk, who can then be funneled into the usual clinical care pathway, and hopefully through that we can make a shift where most cancers could be detected at the early stage.
Really interesting. You hear a lot about using DNA nowadays to personalize medicine and, liquid biopsy. I think those that are into diagnostics, you're seeing increasing number of companies, looking at liquid biopsy as a less invasive way to do this. What made you go down the sort of proteomics route rather than the DNA route for the screening that you're looking at?
It's an interesting field. I think a lot of this has got to do with the history of the technological approaches from the hardware perspective. So if you look at, say, 10 years, 20 years ago, there was a lot of focus on DNA-based technologies. That's where a lot of investment was. That's where technologies are more advanced. And lots of companies are focused on DNA for that reason. But unfortunately, you only have very small quantities of DNA released from tumors at very early stage. And it's hard to detect those at sufficient sensitivity in the blood for early stage detection. You can see as a result, many companies are only achieving between 15 and 30% early stage detection because they're limited by that fundamental issue. We wanted to look at protein in an unbiased way. So the difference really is that DNA is giving you a functional blueprint of what's going on in the body at any point in time, to simplify things. Whereas if you're looking at the DNA, then it's not going to necessarily tell you that. So for example, imagine somebody has a certain mutation. Someone has a certain mutation in a gene. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have a higher level or lower level of that protein overall in interaction with other proteins, which leads to a disease state. So we wanted to have a protein-based approach so we can see what's going on live in a patient. And to do that, you can't simply measure a few proteins which are known to be associated with any disease, because you want to be specific to cancer. So what we need to do is we use something called high-dimensional proteomics, looking at thousands of proteins per patient in a very personalized way. And then through machine learning, we can have a look at that. Fundamentally, I think a multi-omics approach whereby companies look at different modalities is going to be the best. It depends what it is, really. DNA-based methods might be useful for looking at the burden of tumor, how much cancer tissue you have in patients who already have cancer, and to help then with treatment personalization. But for screening, we've seen the limitations, and hopefully our proteomics approach can change that.
Super interesting. And I'm conscious the title of this panel, Annie, is Oncology and More. We've got obviously two great oncology examples here, but being an impact fund, accessible diagnostics is, at the heart of what you do. So, what else are you sort of seeing in and around diagnostics to improve the accessibility in oncology and further?
Yeah. Generally with our fund, because we're an impact fund, what we're trying to figure out in the ecosystem is where are there gaps, particularly for women and children's health in terms of diagnostic and screening. So think about things like, if you think of preeclampsia or sepsis that are leading causes of mortality for mothers and babies. How can we test a little bit more accurately and faster and cheaply at the point of care? That's really where we get interested. Because a lot of these conditions can be diagnosed, but often the machines are extremely expensive, they're rare, or they're just not super accurate, or they take hours in the case of sepsis, but yet you really have minutes to act if you want to get to the best health outcomes. And so that's where we get really excited. There's a lot going on in this space, so it's a matter of choosing our spots in terms of investment. And so what we've tried to do with our first fund is really to pick a few areas of healthcare where we saw the most transformative technology come to market. Mm-hmm.
Really good. I mean, I have to say, being a diagnostic specialist, a lot of what I've just heard from you guys rings absolutely true. Not diagnosing diseases early enough, not being able to screen people, not being able to come to people, I think is another thing there, like getting diagnosis out of hospitals and out of buildings, more portable devices, being able to do more things at home where possible. And also, I guess, for countries that don't have the infrastructure, like in the developing world, as you say, more sustainable portable devices that can give lab-grade testing are some of the sort of really interesting things we see sort of day in, day out in deal flow as well.
What we're seeing is the place where the technology is used when you compare a developed market with a developing market can be different. A technology that is a home technology in the US or in Europe is often the technology that's being used in an emerging market context. Or recently, we're looking at a technology in cardiovascular that is a combination of machine learning and AI with some sensors. In developed markets like the US, it will be used to titrate medicine. But we're looking at use cases in Africa and India where it will actually diagnose the disease as well with respect to heart failure. So it's kind of interesting how the same tool that works on a biological creature that is a human being can be used in different spots depending on what you have going on in your health system.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned the sort of the digital, the AI and machine learning coming in there. I mean, particularly you guys sort of in the startup space, you know, how important is that? How much is that changing what's happening in diagnostics? Obviously, as part of Oxcan, it's a big part of the platform. You know, is that in your platform as well, or are you avoiding that for now?
We are avoiding a bit AI. We truly believe that if we can diagnose with cheaper technologies, so we are also focusing on protein secretome in the gynecological fluids and picking up those proteins that can provide with cheaper diagnostics. We focus on immunoassay because we think that these are very accessible and widely used technologies in all the health systems. So if we can bring biomarkers in those areas that are accessible, this is key. Of course, we are taking all the data. We are trying to understand as much as possible from those fluids and from all the patients that we are recruiting. But so far, we are keeping a bit ahead of doing big AI from our diagnostics.
And how are you using this in your process? More in the discovery side, no, rather than the actual product itself.
Exactly that. And these points are so important to consider. You have the question of scientific optimization, so that it can be clinically useful. But then, as Annie just said, and Marina was saying, depending on the particular part of the world you're in, and even in the same geographical area, depending on which particular part of the healthcare system or which demographic of patients you're interacting with, certain technologies may be prohibitive. And so we need to bridge the research with the actual commercial translation. So for us, we're focusing on using machine learning as part of the discovery process. How can we make the most of thousands of proteins where you have important signal associated with disease, but you also may have distraction variables referred to as noise variables? How do we understand what's real, what isn't? Once we use that machine learning-based step to identify a really succinct panel of biomarkers, we can then translate that into a really scalable approach which doesn't rely on machine learning. So using immunoassay, for instance, which doesn't require any additional infrastructure or training needs, and you can apply immunoassay as a panel for disease detection across the world in healthcare systems.
I think it's a valid point. I don't know what you see as well, Annie, but like definitely when it comes to scaling and the more layers of new technology and I guess lack of understanding, particularly when you get into AI and potential black box, I do see that as obviously huge potential upside, but longer to get the education, to get people on side, to make people trust that. And I think, you know, we see in different models that diagnostics companies are using whereby maybe they see the AI component coming down the track, get the core product out, make sure your core product stands up for itself, with then potential benefits once the sort of consumers got used to your new product. But
yeah, it's definitely what we're seeing, and where it comes about in our portfolio, I think ultimately is we're seeing a number of sensor-based technologies to monitor whether it's the heart rate of an adult, or in the case of one of our companies, they're measuring the oxygenation level of the fetus while in the womb during delivery. Where we're seeing the AI and the machine learning is on making the distinction between multiple different kinds of signals and then getting some information out of that. And ultimately, when we look at the process of getting regulatory approval, it's on the clinical outcomes and how that was generated more so than on certainly using AI for diagnostic. I think we're a little further away from that because the black box concept certainly I don't think medical systems like in the US or Europe are ready to fully accept a truly digital diagnostic. You can bring the information to the doctor, so you narrow down the conditions that they're looking at. That, I think, is a place of comfort and actually works really well with the regulatory frameworks that exist. But so far as giving the final answer, I think we still trust the clinician more.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Another thing that's been mentioned a couple of times by a couple of you on the panel, which you have to bring up as part of accessible diagnostics, is cost. We know healthcare systems don't have a lot of money, they're struggling. And sometimes when I'm going out and trying to sell diagnostics, the sort of feedback I get, particularly on screening and oncology, is that this is going to bring more cost, it could bring more false positives, it can overwhelm the system. So, in terms of, those challenges that are thrown at you, what would be the panel's response to that? Maybe starting with Andreas.
Yeah, exactly. So it depends, again, on the particular area that you're in. What we're doing is we're looking at different iterations of our products based on those considerations. So we may have a product which is able to have very strong performance for cancer detection in a certain context, and that might have maybe 10 proteins as part of the product that we're looking at. And then you may have another product which has more for cases where cancer detection for certain subgroups, for example, might be more challenging and where affordability is more possible. Fundamentally, though, we're focusing on the type of technology which doesn't cost too much, so immunoassay being an example of that for those reasons. And then we also need to make sure that we're planning in the medium and long term with different screening committees which exist in different countries where there are particular thresholds in place for cost saving and cost effectiveness as well. And there's been a lot of research already which has demonstrated for particular types of cancer that early detection can make a big difference in cutting down healthcare costs later on, because treatment is up to 3 times more expensive at late stage compared to early stage. And I think that's the key of aligning those goals.
Marina?
What I can share about what we have learned during the process. So we are developing an endometrial cancer diagnostic test for symptomathology, for patients with symptomathology. So we are not at screening, but like interviewing clinicians and interviewing health systems, we have understood how important is the specificity if you want to bring a screening tool into the market, and also how important is the low cost of this diagnostics or screening tools, because if not, you will not be able to screen a huge population. So also the thing that normally those patients are being visited in primary care versus the specialized centers that are diagnosing oncology, for instance. This it is not still very well connected. So the savings that you can generate in the referral centers, in the cancer centers, are not very well translated to the primary care system where they are bringing the new screening tools, right? So we need to better understand how this can be considered as a whole and bring in a good business case for these new screening tools. It's key, because if not, it will not gonna work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On our side, the way we look at it is, on a deal-by-deal basis, is the new technology price competitive or cheaper than the existing method? So in a case like OxScan, where we're looking at the investment, where we're really comparing what's a CT scan versus the blood biopsy from a COGS level and then from a reimbursement level, both being really quite important to the way we look at the world. In a lot of other cases, if you think of preeclampsia, there's tests being developed right now where one test will give you the information that normally you only sort of diagnose the health condition by ruling out other things. So those are, I would say, the simpler cases where it's obvious that on its own the technology will be cheaper. That's often balanced with more people will get the test. So I think health systems have to look at it a little bit more broadly, comparing the cost of treating the patients earlier versus later. From an impact investor, of course, we're always positive about it because treating disease is really our mission. But I do think that these answers are not as simple as we want to think, because we have to admit that when you offer broader access to healthcare, including diagnosing disease earlier, including screening people, that costs money. And those are things that healthcare systems have to grapple with somehow.
Yeah, I think that's the unfortunate nature, and I think I agree on the sort of compare to the sort of existing versus the new, but we all kind of know that both are probably going to be run together to start with before the healthcare system sees the benefit and then drops it. And I think that is a big problem with diagnostics at the moment, is there's the upfront cost that people have to get their heads around with the savings down the road that aren't necessarily, guaranteed or that people can visualize now. And I mean, we're seeing, a lot of our startups that we're seeing and working with, it's all about setting up the right, economic studies so that you can start getting earlier data and evidence to really prove that out. And I think that is what payers are wanting to see. I mean, I know you're based in North America. I mean, I get the feeling that North America is a bit ahead on the value-based care model than Europe, and we're definitely seeing more of that come there that makes it a little bit easier. But do you feel that's the reality? And what can Europe learn, if that is the reality, from what's going on there to try and catch up and have similar models to support diagnostics companies in this space?
So we look, at so many markets, because by definition, all our companies are active in North America, Europe, and emerging markets. And I would say that there's a similarity there, and at the end of the day, you have to show the value, even though the buyer or the payer, which may not always be the same, may look at things slightly differently. Fundamentally, if you're bringing a new diagnostic or a new screening tool into a market, it has to make business sense, which, for those of us who are impact investors, we look at it and it makes you cringe a little bit, but that's really the reality, is you have to show some sort of cost saving for a tool to be adopted pretty well, irrespective of any market you operate in.
From you guys on the startup side, I guess we'll go with a more negative question first, and we'll finish with a more positive one. But in terms of healthcare systems now, are they ready for what's all this amazing innovation we're seeing in diagnostics? And if you could change one thing to make it more prepared, or you could campaign at that sort of top level, what would be the thing you would want to change? Andreas is smiling.
Yeah, there are many layers there to that question. I think the key thing is making sure that there's transparency and rigor for the clinical evidence base before technology is implemented. Unfortunately, in the case of screening diagnostics, for example, over the past decades, we've seen many examples of companies claiming high performance sensitivity for screening or for diagnostics, but then actually maybe the same data set is used for training as well as also for testing on patients, which means it's not actually proven to work for a new patient population in the future. So I'd say making sure we have a good enough diversity, geographically speaking, different centers, separate testing sets mathematically compared to training, that's important. And then making sure that there's enough educational awareness of the decision makers for those technologies. I would say that for screening diagnostics, though, there's a lot of top-down emphasis in governments in many countries at the moment to push this because of the upcoming looming higher cancer prevalence in society. And so this is actually flowing in our favor as startups. As long as we can communicate the technology, the evidence is there, then we should be able to open those doors.
Yeah, I do agree that from governmental perspective, there is more and more grants that are helping startups like ours, such as the EAC Accelerator, for instance, which is huge. And it's boosting a lot new diagnostics on the space. But it's true that in Europe, for instance, we are facing IVDR. So now bringing new diagnostics is more difficult than it was. So I think that needs change, because if not, we are stopping innovation in Europe. And then this is, if you don't get this regulatory, you cannot get reimbursed. So that at the end, it's a bit of like, are we stopping these diagnostics in Europe? So I think, this needs to be considered, and we need to do something with that.
Yeah, I was going to go exactly there. There needs to be a little bit more harmonization. amongst the different regulatory systems that we're seeing. And certainly being Canadian on the panel, we, much like Europe, are smaller markets because we don't pay the same prices as our American friends. There has to be a better way than going country by country by country with a slightly different file format, and that just adds costs. And at the end of the day, the patients are the ones that suffer. So I just think as a global community, we can do better there.
I would agree, and it's sad at the moment. I think if there is anyone here at the European level of regulatory, we're seeing this so much where great innovation, great startups, and there's great European funding and grants available. So these startups are all getting European money, and then they're all now targeting US as the first market because there's a clearer and faster regulatory pathway that just makes it more sense to go there. And it's sad being here in Europe to see that. And I think definitely something that needs to get fixed at this end.
The Canadians are feeling the same sadness.
We're not alone. But, maybe final remarks, but on a more positive, what is sort of one of the innovations you're seeing or something you're most excited about in the diagnostic space at this stage? And maybe I'll start at the far end this time with Marina.
So I would put companion diagnostics as something that I think it's making a huge difference in terms of safety for the patient and effectiveness for the treatment. And I think that in oncology environment is key, because if not, we are providing a lot of treatments that will not be useful for those patients, so which relates as well with personalized medicine. But I think last year, for instance, it were 4 new FDA-approved companion diagnostics in the cancer space. So I think that's huge, and we need to keep pushing that.
Annie?
I don't know. It's like, what is the most exciting? That's a tough one. But I would say just generally what I'm seeing across our portfolio, and it's probably because that's what we focus on, is just there's just a lot more cost-effective technologies coming to market, and that does cause me to be cautiously optimistic over the next decade for healthcare and women and children. We're seeing conditions like endometriosis today is diagnosed conclusively with a surgery. Laparoscopic surgery is surgery. It's not a walk in the park, and we're now seeing blood-based tests, urine-based tests that are much faster, will take, hopefully a few minutes or maybe a day or a week compared to 7 years to diagnose these conditions. So I do think the pace of innovation is accelerating, and the cost is decreasing, and the efficiency of the tools is really getting to a place where healthcare can materially improve in the next decade.
I think the most exciting facet is the flip side of the negative, so to speak, we said earlier, which is enhanced educational awareness, specifically better integration between scientific understanding for clinical needs and the commercial aspect for key opinion leaders. If you have products which claim to have the ability to solve early detection, but actually the sensitivity and specificity for those use cases isn't as good as claimed, healthcare systems will undoubtedly be overwhelmed and you can't make progress. What's happened is there was initially a phase of a lot of hype where lots of companies were claiming to be able to deliver on this. And now there's been a lot of pushback where higher standards of evidence are being requested. And that means that the best companies who've done the groundwork, who've planned properly the R&D together with the product adoption, those companies are now going to have a much better chance of being able to enter the market at very large scale, because we're separating out the real quality from what isn't. And that has to make sense again from a health economics perspective.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I'd echo what I'm hearing and also just say, I think I really am seeing systems starting to change. The innovation is there. Diagnostics, I truly believe, holds a lot of the answers to what I call the sickness systems. They're not really healthcare systems at the moment. They're broken. They wait till people are ill, and then they put very expensive treatments that don't necessarily work into them and hope for the best. So I see a great future for diagnostics. I see the innovation coming. I'm truly excited about it. I know the panel are, and we're really excited to see so many people in the audience for a diagnostics topic at this conference. So thank you for listening. Thank you, panel, for sharing your words of wisdom.